On a foggy pier in Portland Harbor, Carter Hayes alone counted coins beside his daughter Gwen. Praying they'd cover one bowl of chowder, Hillary Price, the sharp-tongued waitress at the Copper Lantern, didn't just refuse his bills, she held them up like trash and announced his charity case to the dining room. Forks paused. Phones lifted. Gwen's eyes filled. Carter tried to smile, but his hands shook. From a corner booth, a man set down his espresso and stood. William Sterling, the Billionaire CEO. No one ever questions had watched everything. He didn't argue. He dialed once, "Buy this restaurant, fire her, tonight." But what Carter didn't know was that this single phone call would unravel secrets buried for decades, expose a predator hiding behind a manager's smile, and reveal a debt of kindness that had waited 20 years to be repaid. Portland Harbor, in winter, was a place where fog swallowed the pier before sunrise and salt wind cut through the thickest coats. The fishing boats groaned against their ropes. The foghorns called out like mourners at a funeral nobody attended. It was the kind of town where working men aged faster than the calendar allowed, where calloused hands were currency, and where pride was often the only thing a man had left to call his own. The Copper Lantern had stood on the corner of Wharf Street for nearly 50 years. Its copper lamps, tarnished green by sea air, still flickered with the warmth of another era. Photographs of fishing crews from the 1960s lined the walls. The wooden tables were dark with decades of spilled beer and scrubbed clean again. Through the fog-streaked windows, you could watch the boats come and go. Watch fortunes rise and fall with the tide. The restaurant served everyone sailors fresh off 3-week hauls, dock workers with aching backs, tourists searching for authenticity, and old-timers who remembered when the harbor meant something. But beneath its welcoming facade, the Copper Lantern operated by unwritten rules. Those who tipped generously received smiles and refills. Those who paid in crumpled bills and loose change were treated as inconveniences, obstacles to better customers with fatter wallets. This culture had a name. Though no one spoke it aloud, it was Bernie Knox's culture. Carter Hayes never wanted pity. He wanted work at 42 years old. He had learned that the world rarely gave you what you wanted. But sometimes, if you showed up early and stayed late, it gave you just enough to survive. He worked the docks hauling crates, mending ropes, scrubbing decks for whatever captain needed an extra hand. Some days brought $40. Some days brought nothing but blisters and aching shoulders. He had not always lived this way. Once, he had been a promising mechanic at a boat repair shop, earning enough to rent a small house, to buy Gwen new shoes when she needed them, to dream of someday owning his own business. Then the shop closed. The owner's son had gambling debts. And one morning the doors were simply locked, the equipment sold, the employees given nothing but apologies and empty promises. That was 3 years ago. 3 years of odd jobs and temporary work, and the slow erosion of savings that had never been large enough to begin with. Carter had considered leaving Portland Harbor. There were bigger cities with more opportunities, but this town was where Gwen's mother had been born, where she had died giving birth, where her memory still lived in the salt air and the cry of gulls. He could not bring himself to take Gwen away from the only connection she had to a mother she would never know. He lived with his daughter Gwen in a 2-room apartment above a bait shop. The walls were thin enough to hear the seagulls crying at dawn. The radiator worked when it felt like it. But the place was clean, and Gwen had her own bed. And Carter made sure she never went to school without breakfast, even if that meant he skipped his own. Carter had one rule he repeated to Gwen like a prayer. We might be poor, but we don't bow. We don't beg. We stand straight, and we look people in the eye. Gwen was 8 years old, small for her age, with hair that refused to stay in its ponytail, and eyes that noticed everything. She was the kind of child who tied her own shoes before she turned 5, who folded paper napkins into swans at restaurants, who always said, "I'm not hungry," even when her stomach growled loud enough to hear. She understood things no 8-year-old should have to understand. She knew when her father was worried by the way he checked his wallet twice. She knew when money was tight by the way he said maybe next time instead of yes. And she knew, with the cruel clarity of childhood, exactly when someone was looking at her with pity or contempt. On the night everything changed, Gwen had been coughing for 3 days, a cold that wouldn't break. Carter had heard that the Copper Lantern served the best clam chowder on the harbor hot. Creamy, thick enough to cure anything that ailed you. He had just been paid for 2 days of deck work, crumpled bills and a handful of coins. He counted it 3 times and decided it was enough for 1 bowl. They could share. Hillary Price had worked at the Copper Lantern for 4 years. She was efficient, sharp-eyed, quick on her feet. She knew the menu by heart, knew which customers to flatter and which to rush along, knew exactly how to angle a smile to maximize her tips. Bernie Knox called her his best server. What he meant was that she had learned to play his game. But efficiency had hardened into something else over the years. A permanent sneer lived at the corner of her mouth. Her eyes assessed every customer who walked through the door their clothes, their watches, their posture, and sorted them into categories worth her time. Or not. What no one knew was that Hillary carried her own invisible weight. A mother in a nursing home she couldn't afford. A landlord who threatened eviction every month. A boss who docked her pay for every imagined infraction. She had learned that in Bernie's world. The only way to survive was to punch down before someone punched you. It didn't excuse what she did, but it explained the machinery that made her. The night of the Harbor Festival, the Copper Lantern was packed. The fog had rolled in thick as wool, and everyone wanted warmth and chowder and the comfort of a crowd. Tables were full. The kitchen was backed up. Phones were out, capturing the festive chaos for friends and family who weren't there. Carter walked in holding Gwen's hand. She was still coughing, her nose red, her eyes tired. He guided her to a small table near the window and helped her into the chair. The menu was laminated and sticky. He didn't need to read it. He already knew what he could afford. Hillary appeared at the table, order pad in hand, eyes already moving past them to the well-dressed couple waiting by the door. "1 clam chowder, please," Carter said. "To share." He pulled out his money, a small pile of 1s and 5s, soft from being folded too many times, mixed with quarters and dimes. He began counting it on the table, making sure he had enough before he ordered. Hillary stared at the pile of bills and coins. Her lip curled. "Sir," she said, loud enough for the nearby tables to hear. "We're not a charity. If you can't afford to eat here, there's a soup kitchen on 5th Street. Carter's hands froze over the money. He looked up at her, confusion giving way to a flush of shame that started at his neck and climbed to his cheeks. "I have enough," he said quietly. I counted. But Hillary wasn't finished. She picked up one of his crumpled bills between two fingers, holding it away from her body like something contagious. She turned to face the dining room, her voice carrying across the crowded space. "Everyone, look at this. A charity case trying to pay with pocket change. Some people have no shame." The restaurant fell silent. Forks stopped midway to mouths. Conversations died. And then the phones. One by one. Screens rose from tables. Cameras pointed at Carter and Gwen like weapons. Gwen's eyes filled with tears. She tugged at her father's sleeve, her voice barely a whisper. "Daddy, let's go. Please." Carter tried to smile for her. He tried to show her that words couldn't hurt them, that dignity was something you carried inside where no one could touch it. But his hands were shaking, and his smile broke apart before it could form. In a corner booth, away from the commotion, a man in a dark jacket set down his espresso. He had been watching. He had seen everything, the counting, the sneer, the cruelty, the cameras, the little girl's tears. His name was William Sterling, and he was worth more money than this entire harbor town would see in a century. William had come to Portland Harbor to survey a development project, Luxury Marina. Upscale restaurants, the usual transformation of working-class charm into wealthy playground. He had dressed simply, avoiding attention. No one had recognized him. He had wanted to see the town as it really was, not the version that people performed when they knew a billionaire was watching. But something in this scene had unlocked a door in his memory that he kept bolted shut. The image of a mother in a second-hand coat, surrounded by sneering faces. A little boy too small to help, too young to understand, too powerless to do anything but watch. The way his mother's shoulders had crumpled, the way she had stopped singing for weeks afterward, as if the cruelty had stolen the music from her voice. William had built his empire on that memory. Every acquisition, every deal, every ruthless negotiation, he had told himself it was all to ensure he would never be powerless again. But tonight, watching that little girl's tears, he realized something had gone wrong along the way. He had become powerful. Yes, but had he become good? William stood. He walked past Carter without a word, without even glancing at the man whose dignity was bleeding onto the floor. He stepped outside into the fog, pulled out his phone, and made a single call. "Oliver," he said to his lawyer, "the Copper Lantern on Wharf Street. I want to own it by morning, whatever it costs, whatever it takes." He ended the call and stood in the fog, listening to the distant foghorns, feeling the salt wind against his face. Behind him, through the restaurant's foggy windows, he could see Gwen burying her face in her father's coat. By sunrise, the deal was done. The Copper Lantern's previous owner had been drowning in debt bank loans, supplier payments, a second mortgage on a building that needed repairs he couldn't afford. When Oliver called with an offer 50% above market value and promised to close within 12 hours. The man didn't ask questions. He signed the papers before his morning coffee was cold. The staff arrived at 7 to find new security guards at the door and legal documents posted in the break room. Bernie Knox, who had managed the restaurant for 8 years, felt his stomach drop when he read the name on the transfer papers. William Sterling. The William Sterling. Bernie was a survivor. He had built his little empire on intimidation and manipulation, on skimming tips and falsifying time cards, on creating a culture where servers competed to please him rather than their customers. He knew immediately that his world was about to change. But Bernie was also an actor, within seconds. His shock transformed into a warm smile, a posture of humble cooperation. The staff meeting was brief. William Sterling stood at the front of the dining room, still wearing his simple dark jacket, looking nothing like a billionaire and everything like a man with absolute authority. "My name is William Sterling," he said. "As of 6 this morning. I own this restaurant." The silence was total. Servers clutched their aprons. Line cooks shifted nervously. Bernie maintained his pleasant smile. Waiting. William's gaze found Hillary Price in the back of the room. "Last night," he continued, his voice flat and precise, "a father came into this restaurant with his sick daughter. He wanted to buy her a bowl of soup. He had enough money. He counted it carefully because that's what people do when every dollar matters. And instead of serving him, a member of this staff publicly humiliated him, called him a charity case, held up his money like garbage, made his little girl cry while strangers filmed her shame." Hillary's face had gone pale. She opened her mouth to speak, but William raised a hand. "I don't want explanations. I don't want excuses. You humiliated a father in front of his daughter. That child will carry that memory forever." He paused. "You're fired. Immediately. Security will escort you out." Hillary's voice cracked. "I was just following there is no policy that requires cruelty. There is no rule that demands you strip a man of his dignity for trying to feed his child. You made a choice. Now you live with it." Bernie Knox stepped forward, his expression arranged into something resembling compassion. "Mr. Sterling, if I may, Hillary has been with us for years. Perhaps we could discuss a probationary period. Some sensitivity training." No. The word landed like a gavel. Hillary was escorted out minutes later, still in her apron, her belongings in a plastic bag. Some of her co-workers watched with barely concealed satisfaction. She had not been kind to those she saw as beneath her. Others felt a chill of fear. If it could happen to Hillary, it could happen to anyone. Bernie Knox continued smiling. Already, his mind was working on how to turn this situation to his advantage. Carter Hayes learned what had happened from a neighbor who had seen the news. A billionaire had bought the copper lantern overnight and fired the waitress who had mocked a poor father. The story was everywhere: local news, regional papers, the endless machinery of public attention. Carter did not feel victorious. He felt sick. He sat on the edge of Gwen's bed that night while she pretended to sleep. And he thought about what this meant. A rich man had used his money like a weapon, destroying someone's livelihood in an instant. It was justice. Perhaps. But it was also power. Raw and absolute. The kind of power that could crush anyone who stood in its way. "Is this what I want Gwen to learn?" he whispered to himself. "That money can fix everything. That having enough dollars means you can punish anyone you choose." Gwen stirred. She had not been sleeping. "Daddy," she said quietly. "That lady was mean, but now she doesn't have a job. Is that okay?" Carter had no answer. He stroked her hair until she finally drifted off, and he sat in the darkness for a long time, trying to understand what had happened to his life. The footage spread through the world with the mindless velocity of modern outrage. But the videos that circulated were not complete. They had been clipped and edited to maximize drama. They showed Hillary's cruelty. Yes, but they also showed William Sterling standing up like a hero, without context, without explanation. No one knew he had bought the restaurant that same night. No one understood the full story, and so the public divided into warring camps. Some celebrated William as a defender of the downtrodden. Others condemned him as a tyrant who had destroyed a working woman's career on a whim. Some praised Carter as a sympathetic victim. Others accused him of staging the entire incident for attention, of being a paid actor in some elaborate scheme. A local blogger named Rosalind Chen saw opportunity in the chaos. She had built her following on scandal and controversy, and this story had both in abundance. She began interviewing Portland Harbor residents, collecting quotes and rumors, spinning narratives that grew more sensational with each iteration. Carter found himself followed on the docks. Strangers with cameras asked him how much William Sterling had paid him. They photographed Gwen walking to school. They speculated about his past, his finances, his motives. He did not fight back. He did not defend himself. He simply took Gwen's hand and walked away, again and again, until his silence became its own kind of story. But Gwen was not silent. Gwen was 8 years old, and her world had become a nightmare. Children at school repeated the things they heard their parents say. They called her father a beggar. They pretended to film her with their hands, mimicking the phones at the restaurant. They laughed. Gwen stopped laughing. She stopped talking much at all. She began sleeping with the light on, waking from nightmares she wouldn't describe. Carter watched his daughter retreat into herself, and he felt a helplessness worse than any poverty. Meanwhile, William Sterling faced pressure from every direction. His advisor, Henry, a careful man who had spent years managing William's public image, warned him that the backlash was intensifying. "If you become the story," Henry said, "the development project is finished. The town council is already getting calls. People are saying you're a bully, that you'll destroy local businesses, that you have no respect for working people. You need to step back, issue an apology. Let this blow over." William stared out the window of his hotel suite, watching the fog crawl across the harbor. "I'm not apologizing for firing someone who humiliated a child. It's not about right or wrong anymore. It's about perception. Then let them perceive this. I will not buy silence. I will not pretend that cruelty is acceptable because admitting it's wrong is inconvenient." Henry left the meeting frustrated. William remained at the window, thinking about a little girl's tears and the way they had transported him backward through time. In the shadows of the copper lantern, Bernie Knox was playing his own game. He fed whispers to anyone who would listen that William Sterling was planning mass layoffs, that the restaurant would become an exclusive club for the wealthy, that local tradition was being sacrificed to corporate greed. He nudged former staff to speak to reporters with carefully crafted grievances. He reached out to Hillary, suggesting that if she accused Carter of staging the incident, she might find sympathy and perhaps even her job back. Bernie understood that chaos was opportunity. The more the public fought among themselves, the less attention they paid to him, to his skimmed tips, his falsified records, his years of exploitation hidden behind copper lamps and nostalgic photographs. A week after her firing, Hillary returned to the copper lantern after midnight. She still had her key, an oversight no one had corrected. The restaurant was dark, the chairs stacked on tables, the kitchen silent, except for the hum of refrigerators. She had come for her things: a phone charger, a sweater, the tips Bernie had withheld from her final week. But as she moved through the shadows toward the office, she heard a voice. Bernie's voice, muffled through the closed door, speaking on the phone. "The bigger the scandal, the better. You think people are coming here for the chowder? They're coming because they saw the videos. Controversy is free advertising. And the tip pool from last month, we split it my way, same as always. Anyone complains, they know what happens." Hillary froze. She pressed herself against the wall, barely breathing. Through the door, she heard Bernie laugh. "Hillary, She's useful. If she goes to the press with the right story, we can turn this whole thing around, make Sterling look like the villain, get some sympathy for the local workers, maybe even get some compensation out of it. She'll do what I tell her. She always has. The conversation continued, but Hillary heard nothing more. Her mind was racing. For years, she had believed that her cruelty was survival, that Bernie's world required her to be harsh to protect herself. But she was not a survivor. She was a tool. And when she was no longer useful, she would be discarded like the crumpled bills she had once mocked. She moved to Bernie's computer terminal, her fingers trembling. The backup system was still logged in. Bernie was careless with technology, confident that no one would dare challenge him. Hillary copied files onto a flash drive, tip records, schedule manipulations, deleted security footage, text messages, evidence of every petty crime Bernie had committed for 8 years. Then she slipped back into the fog, the flash drive heavy in her pocket, her certainty heavier still. She had done something terrible to Carter and Gwen. She had been cruel, because cruelty was the air she breathed in Bernie's restaurant. But she was done being Bernie's weapon. The following days brought escalation. Bernie, realizing that something had changed, went on the offensive. He filed a police report accusing Hillary of theft and vandalism. He posted in local community groups that she had been stealing from the tip pool for years, a lie, but one that found fertile ground among people already eager to believe the worst. Carter found himself pulled deeper into the storm. A stranger approached him on the docks with an offer $5,000 to appear on television and claimed that William Sterling had paid him to stage the restaurant incident. Carter refused, and within days, he was accused of disturbing the peace at the harbor. He nearly lost his unloading shifts, the only steady income he had. Gwen's nightmares grew worse. She began waking in the middle of the night, clutching her father's coat, asking questions that broke his heart. "Daddy, why do people hate us? What did we do wrong?" William Sterling, watching the chaos unfold, made a decision. He hired an independent auditor named Beatrix Holden, a woman known for her forensic precision and complete immunity to intimidation. Her task was simple: examine every financial record the Copper Lantern had produced under Bernie Knox's management. What Beatrix found was systematic theft, tips skimmed from every shift, hours shaved from paychecks, fake invoices from suppliers who didn't exist. A web of fraud so thorough and so brazen that it could only have been built by someone who believed he would never be caught. The town held a meeting at the community center. The purpose was to address concerns about corporate takeover, about the future of local businesses, about the stranger from the outside world who had bought a piece of Portland Harbor's soul. The old gymnasium was packed with folding chairs, the walls lined with championship banners from high school basketball teams long graduated. The air thick with tension and the smell of decades-old varnish. William Sterling attended alone. He sat in a metal folding chair in the front row while 100 voices rose behind him, demanding answers, demanding accountability, demanding that he explain himself. He could feel their eyes on his back like heat, their suspicion like a physical weight. Carter was there too, though he had not wanted to come. The organizers had invited him as the victim, a symbol of local dignity, and he had agreed only because he feared what might happen to Gwen if he remained invisible. He sat near the back, his hands clasped in his lap, wishing he were anywhere else. When his turn came to speak, Carter stood slowly. The room fell silent. He walked to the microphone at the front, his work boots loud on the gymnasium floor, His flannel shirt faded but clean. He had nothing prepared. He spoke from the hollow place in his chest where his daughter's tears had taken up residence. "I didn't ask for any of this," he said. "I don't want pity. I don't want to be famous. I just want to raise my daughter in peace." He paused, his voice steady despite the cameras pointed at him. "What happened that night hurt us. My little girl still has nightmares. She's afraid to go into restaurants now. She thinks everyone is watching her, judging her, getting ready to make her feel small." He looked at the crowd, meeting their eyes one by one. "I'm not here to tell you who the good guys are. I'm not here to defend anyone or attack anyone. I'm just asking you, all of you, to stop making my daughter a punchline. She's 8 years old. She deserves better." He sat down. The room remained silent for a long moment. Then, from the back, a woman pushed through the crowd. Hillary Price. Pale and thin, looking nothing like the sharp-tongued server who had held up crumpled bills like garbage. She walked to the front of the room and faced Carter. "I owe you an apology," she said, her voice breaking. "What I did was cruel. I made your daughter cry, and I told myself it didn't matter because—" She stopped, struggling for control. "Because I had learned to believe that some people don't matter. I was wrong." She turned to the crowd and held up a flash drive. "Bernie Knox has been stealing from this restaurant for years. He taught me to be cruel because cruelty kept customers moving, kept complaints quiet, kept everyone too scared to challenge him. The night that video was taken, he signaled me to drive that father away because a family paying with coins made the restaurant look bad to wealthy tourists." The room erupted. Bernie, who had been standing near the exit, tried to slip away, but Beatrix Holden blocked his path. "The evidence is comprehensive," she said calmly. "Mr. Knox, I suggest you remain until the authorities arrive." William Sterling stood and walked to the front of the room. The crowd quieted again, wary, uncertain. This man had power they could not comprehend. What would he do with it? "I owe you an explanation," William said. "You deserve to know why I did what I did." He took a breath. 20 years ago, my mother worked on a dock very much like this one. She cleaned fish, she mended nets, she earned barely enough to keep us fed. One day, she tried to buy lunch at a restaurant, paying with coins she had saved for weeks. A woman behind the counter held up her money and called her trash, said she was disgusting, said people like her didn't deserve to eat in places like that. The room was perfectly still. I was 11 years old. I watched my mother cry. I watched strangers laugh, and I couldn't do anything. I was too small, too young, too powerless. He looked at Carter. "When I saw what happened to you and your daughter, I saw my mother, I saw myself, and I decided I was not going to be powerless anymore." He paused. "But there's something else. Something I didn't know until tonight." William turned to face Carter directly. "The day my mother was humiliated, a young man stepped in. He didn't know her. He had no reason to help. But he put himself between her and the crowd. He gave her his coat because she was shaking. He walked her out of that restaurant and told her that she was worth more than their cruelty." Carter's face had gone pale. "My mother kept his coat for years." William continued. "She told me about him every time I was losing hope. 'There are good people,' she would say. That young man proved it." William reached into his jacket and pulled out a faded photograph. A young man in a fishing sweater, standing on a dock, smiling at the camera. "This is the picture my mother took that day. She never knew his name, but I know him now." He handed the photograph to Carter. Carter stared at it. His own face. 20 years younger. looked back at him. He remembered the day, the woman in the thin coat, the ugly crowd, the feeling that he had to do something, even if it wasn't enough. "That was your mother," Carter whispered. "Yes," William said. "And you saved her. You gave her kindness when the world gave her contempt. I have been trying to repay that debt my entire life without knowing who I owed." The room was silent. Someone was crying. Bernie Knox was handcuffed by officers who had arrived during the revelation, his face a mask of shock and fury. In the weeks that followed, the copper lantern transformed. William kept his promise: no luxury rebranding, no exclusive clientele. The restaurant remained what it had always been, a harbor landmark, serving working people and tourists and old-timers who remembered better days. But the culture changed. A new sign hung above the entrance: "Respect first. Always." William established the community table program, a section of the restaurant where anyone could eat and pay what they could afford. Those who had made mistakes could volunteer there, learning to serve with dignity instead of contempt. Carter was offered a position as operations manager, overseeing the back of house and helping train new staff. He accepted on one condition: it was a job, not charity. He would earn his paycheck. He would sign a real contract with real benefits. He would stand as an equal, not a dependent. William agreed without hesitation. Gwen returned to the copper lantern for the first time since that terrible night. She walked through the door holding her father's hand, her eyes moving cautiously around the room, searching for threats that were no longer there. Her grip tightened as she passed the threshold, her small fingers digging into Carter's palm. Carter felt her hesitation and knelt beside her. "We don't have to stay," he whispered. "We can leave any time you want." Gwen looked at him with those eyes that had seen too much, that had learned too young how cruel the world could be. Then she took a breath and shook her head. "I want to stay. Daddy, I want to be brave." They sat at a table near the window, the same table where everything had fallen apart, the same view of the fog-shrouded harbor, the same copper lamps casting warm light across dark wood. But everything felt different now, lighter somehow, as if the shadows had been swept away. A server approached, not Hillary, but someone new, someone trained in the new culture. Her smile was genuine, her voice warm without being performative. "What can I get you, sweetheart?" Gwen reached into her pocket and placed a single coin on the table. A quarter, saved from the allowance Carter had started giving her just 2 weeks ago. It was all she had, and she set it down like it was made of gold. "I want to pay," she said quietly, "because I want to." Carter's eyes filled with tears. He tried to speak but couldn't. 3 words kept repeating in his mind: she's not broken. His little girl, who had stopped laughing, who had flinched at strangers, who had asked him why people hated them. She was sitting straight in her chair, looking the server in the eye, claiming her place at this table like it was her birthright. This was the victory: not money, not revenge, not power, just a little girl who no longer felt small. Hillary Price spent her days at the community table, serving meals to people who reminded her of the man she had humiliated. She did not ask for forgiveness. She did not expect redemption. She simply worked, day after day, learning to see people instead of categories, learning to offer kindness instead of judgment. The work was harder than she had expected, not physically, but emotionally. Every person who walked through the door carrying shame in their shoulders, Every child who looked up at her with wariness in their eyes reminded her of what she had been, what she had done. The memory of Gwen's tears visited her every night, and she had stopped trying to push it away. She deserved to carry it. It was the weight of her education. One evening, a man came in, a father with tired eyes and a daughter with a runny nose. They had the look of people who counted their money before ordering. The father's hands were rough with labor, his jacket patched at the elbows. The little girl clutched a stuffed animal that had been washed so many times its color had faded to gray. Hillary felt her throat tighten. She could have been looking at Carter and Gwen from months ago. She could have been looking at her own cruelty reflected back at her. She brought them the best chowder the kitchen had made that day. She set it down gently, making sure the bowl was positioned where the little girl could reach it easily. Then she leaned close, her voice soft. "Welcome," she said. "I'm glad you're here. You take your time. Stay as long as you like." The father looked up at her, surprised by the warmth in her voice. He started to say something, thank you, perhaps, or an apology for taking up space, but Hillary shook her head. "You don't owe anyone an explanation for being here," she said. "This table is yours." She walked away before he could see the tears in her eyes. The fog still rolled across Portland Harbor every winter evening. The foghorns still called out their lonely warnings. The fishing boats still groaned against their ropes. But inside the copper lantern, beneath the green tarnished copper lamps, something had changed. The tables were still dark wood. The photographs still showed crews from another century, and the chowder was still thick enough to cure what ailed you. And at a corner table, a little girl laughed at something her father said, a sound like bells, like hope, like the promise that dignity could survive even the cruelest storms. William Sterling stood outside in the fog, watching through the window. He did not go in. Some moments were not his to join. He understood now that justice was not about punishment. It was not about power or money or the satisfaction of seeing enemies fall. Justice was simpler than that, and harder. Justice was a child who could finally hold her head high. Justice was a man who could feed his family without shame. Justice was a table where no one had to bow. The fog swallowed the harbor, and the lights of the copper lantern glowed warm against the gray. And somewhere in the distance, a boat horn sounded not a mourning cry anymore, but something almost like a welcome.